Welcome to Wellywood Wargaming, where the grim dark never sleeps. Crack open a bottle of Wild Snake and spark up a low stick as we take a journey down Underhive. Gorkamorka.
This 1997 Gamez Workshop classic may not have lasted long, but its roaring engines and raucous orcs left an indelible mark on the Warhammer community. While Gorkamorka may have been a short-lived classic, its influence still exists in Gamez Workshop's game design today. Let's take a drive into its lore, mechanics, miniatures, and everything that makes Gorkamorka such an absolutely undisputed heavyweight classic in the Warhammer community today. Gorkamorka was released in 1997 when I was just 16 years old, riding the wave of the success of Necromunda, another skirmish-based game that I may or may not have mentioned a couple of times on this channel that had revolutionised the miniatures gaming scene just 2 years earlier in 95. However, where Necromunda was set on a gritty industrial imperial hive world, Gorkamorka transported players to a desolate, dust-choked planet filled with scrap, carnage and orcs. It was set in the same Warhammer 40k universe, but the focus was on the raucous and unpredictable nature of orc culture. Gamez Workshop marketed Gorkamorka as a standalone game, but they were keen to highlight its connection to the larger 40k universe. The promotional material highlighted two main elements: vehicular combat and the irreverent, anarchic cockney humour of the orcs. Players could build, customise and drive their own war machines through a post-apocalyptic wasteland while clashing with rival mobs in a mix of death race mayhem and skirmish combat. Unfortunately, despite its strong and noble premise, the game never quite found the same lasting success as Necromunda or Warhammer 40k. One reason for this was its limited scope. Only a few factions and vehicles were ever released, and its highly niche theme meant it wasn't as accessible to all 40k players. The design team of absolute legends, including a trio of Rick Priestley, Andy Chambers and Gavin Thorpe, set out to create a game that captured the full absurdity and resourcefulness of orc culture. They wanted to give players the freedom to be as creative as possible, combining elements of vehicular combat, scrap collection and the love of absurd, ramshackle engineering. The design had clear roots in, of course, Mad Max and later Dark Future, with orc vehicles designed to be as wildly imaginative as they were destructive. It was an environment where any vehicle could be turned into a brutal war machine, and that sense of freedom became one of the game's defining features. The central feature of the setting was the Skid, an enormous trench that had been carved into the desert after an orc space hulk crashed on the planet. This trench became the home of the Gorkas and the Morkas, two rival factions of orcs, each divided by their ideological differences. In typical orc fashion, these differences were exaggerated and absurd. The Gorkas worshipped Gork, the orc god of destruction, while the Morkas worshipped Mork, the god of cunning. Both factions were constantly engaged in petty squabbles, always competing to be the most brutal, destructive, or cunning. These two factions helped to give the game a sense of factional rivalry that added richness to the lore. At its core, Gorkamorka was a skirmish game that emphasised vehicular combat and the use of orc and grot mobs. Players controlled their mobs of orcs, each with its own set of characteristics and skills. The key selling point of the game, though, was its vehicular combat system, which was surprisingly detailed for a game from the 90s. Each vehicle had a range of attributes, movement, armour, weapons, and the game featured detailed rules for ramming, shooting and crashing. Movement was handled through a series of dice rolls, and vehicles could perform high-speed manoeuvres that risked damaging them. The core of the system encouraged risky, aggressive gameplay, which was perfectly aligned with the orc mindset. Who wouldn't want to hit the gas and tear through the battlefield knowing their vehicles could break down at any moment? What set Gorkamorka apart from other skirmish games of the time was its campaign system. Much like Necromunda, players could create and evolve their orc mobs over time. Mobs could gain experience, acquire new skills and collect scrap, which served as both currency and a way to repair or upgrade your vehicles. The campaign system also introduced a form of progression, as most mobs battled for control of territory and resources in an ever-changing wasteland. One of the standout features of the setting was the concept of something called digger knobs. Strange word, I know. Human factions who had taken to the desert in the hopes of scavenging scraps and trying to mimic orc culture, complete with ramshackle buggies, scrap armour and, of course, green face paint. They also introduced wasteland mutant tribes and other greeblies down the road. This added an element of variety to the game as players could choose to play as these opportunistic scavengers or align themselves with the full throttle madness of the orcs. The miniatures in Gorkamorka were a true reflection of the game's anarchic spirit. The orcs were chunky and exaggerated, full of character and personality. The box set included 2 orc trucks and war tracks, which players could customise with an assortment of bits and scrap. Players could use bits from their own Warhammer 40k collections, and Gorkamorka became a haven for orc kit bashing and conversions. Want to build a ramshackle buggy covered in guns and scrap? Go for it. The more absurd and over the top, the better. You could also stick any amount of orcs on the back of these wagons, provided the miniatures physically fit onto the vehicle. The terrain was equally fitting. The Gorkamorka box set included card templates for basic orc fortifications, desert terrain, and a few scatter features, but it was clear that the game embraced a DIY aesthetic. Players were encouraged to create their own custom terrain using household items, giving the game a distinct, hands-on feel. Scrap piles, wrecked vehicles, and crumbling structures all became part of the tabletop battlefield, immersing players even more in the wild world of orc mayhem. The lore of Gorkamorka was just as mental as the orcs themselves. After the crash landing of the orc Space Hulk, the orcs set up camp in the vast desert, scavenging for resources and scrap. Gork and Mork, the orc gods, played a central role in the mythology of the setting. The Gorkas and Morkas were locked in eternal rivalry, each faction trying to outdo the other in destruction, cunning, or sheer unbridled madness. This dynamic was further complicated by the presence of the muties, yucky mutants who lived on the fringes of orc society, and of course, the digger knobs, human scavengers who tried to survive the wastelands by mimicking orc behaviour. These groups added richness to the setting, making the desert world feel like a truly anarchic, dangerous place where survival required both wit and firepower. When it was first released, Gorkamorka was met with moderate enthusiasm. Critics praised its innovative vehicular combat system and the ability to customise vehicles and orc mobs. However, the game's complex mechanics, especially the rules for vehicles, turned some players off. The learning curve was a little steep, and the rules for ramming, movement and shooting in close combat could be difficult to manage for newcomers. Despite its few challenges, Gorkamorka became a cult classic. The game didn't have the lasting appeal of Warhammer 40k or of Necromunda, but it captured the imaginations of players who loved its anarchic tone and the freedom it offered in customising vehicles. The game also had a lasting influence on later titles, including Gaslands, which took the vehicular combat concept and ran with it, and Necromunda, of course, which incorporated vehicles into its later Ash Waste setting. In the Warhammer 40k community, Gorkamorka remains a nostalgic favourite, remembered fondly for its over-the-top fun and its celebration of orc culture. Gorkamorka may not have achieved the same legendary status as other Gamez Workshop games, but its impact on the hobby remains undeniable. The game captured the essence of orc culture with its chaotic gameplay, custom vehicles and absurd humour. Whether you're dusting off your orc trucks or diving into the lore for the first time, Gorkamorka holds a special place in the hearts of many. Thanks for joining me on this journey through the wild, wild world of Gorkamorka. If you've got any stories, memories or thoughts about the game, drop them down in the comments below. Until next time,
Keep your engines roaring, your dacker blazing, and may your orc mobs rule the skid.